Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have the great honor and the great pleasure of having Pio Abad with us. We're a group of 8 international artists and designers at the Royal College of Art. And together with the London Design Museum, we've been wanting to make a symposium that's accessible to the widest audience possible. It's called, as you may know, Make It Public. And our group focuses on materials, especially paper. So Pio today has very kindly agreed to come and talk to us a little bit about his practice. And then he'll be taking questions from us and questions that we've also received from the other parts of the audience. To give you a brief idea, Pio is a Filipino international artist who's currently living in London. He's a graduate of the University of the Philippines, the Glasgow School of Art in England, and he also has a master's from the Royal Academy Schools in London. For the past 10 years, he's been exhibiting all around the world, including at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, for example. Also, he's exhibited and done residencies in Europe, Australia, and Asia, and in the US. So we're very excited to welcome him today, and I will let him tell you more about himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to do this conversation, which unfortunately we can't do in person, but it's good to sort of see everyone virtually. As Alice said, I was born and raised in Manila in the Philippines, but I now work in London. And my practice normally involves so much travel and so many different contexts. So the past 100 and odd days of isolation has been like a really interesting time to kind of reconsider ways of working, and also to kind of think about the practice and think about, how the practice can evolve given, this unprecedented situation we find ourselves in. Where to start? I guess I work in quite a lot of different media. So from textiles to photography to writing to sculpture. But ultimately, the work really begins with drawings, with works on paper. And, since lockdown, it really has only just been drawings, because it's not been possible to do anything else. So this conversation has come at quite an interesting time when really it seems like the entire art world has been working on paper. And I'm not different from that. But also for me, like, drawings are really the way to start thinking about ideas and to start kind of mapping these different histories and different contexts that are present in my work. I guess just to give you a very kind of quick overview, I work, I guess although my media changes, ultimately what I'm drawn to are like objects that carry very specific political and economic histories. And so the work really begins with researching what these objects are. So trawling through archives, looking at auction catalogs, and gathering information. And then once this information is put together, they then become drawings. So I'll share a couple of works on paper just to give you an idea of the work. So for instance, an ongoing series of drawings I've been doing is this series called Notes and Decomposition. This is it installed in Glasgow at the Centre for Contemporary Art in 2016. I'm not sure if you can see that. Nod if you can. And it's really like so much of my work, it really begins as an inventory of objects. And in this case, it's an inventory of objects that I've found through auction catalogs. And these auction catalogs relate to very specific histories of political collapse. So just to zoom in on one, so on each sheet of paper, there's 12 objects, and these 12 objects are taken from, like I said, these auctions. So beginning with the 1991 auction of Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos's silverware after they were kicked out of the Philippines in 1986. And then it travels all the way to 2010 when the Lehman Brothers collection of objects was auctioned off after the bank fell in 2008, kind of precipitating the economic crisis of the early 2000s, and then going all the way to 2013 when, or 2015, when Margaret Thatcher's family auctioned off all her belongings. And it was kind of, there's something kind of really appropriate about her entire history of objects being open to the market, to the highest bidder. So these drawings really, for me, kickstart this process of gathering information, collecting inventories, and ultimately finding a way to narrate histories in a way that, you know, the audience can be seduced by the beauty of the work. And then as you're sucked into the form, you're allowed, you know, you're given access to more histories and to kind of events that have largely, you know, been forgotten or are largely kind of in the process of being forgotten. So the relationship between history, mapping, and drawing are really key to how I think about my practice. Let me see what, I'll just show a couple more drawings, just so you get a sense. So this is the work installed at the Oakville Galleries in Ontario last year, and it's the entire collection of blue and white vases from the Lehman Brothers collection. And I think at the heart of it as well is an interest in the private histories of public institutions, whether it's a government, a bank, or a world leader, that by going through these objects, you are privy to these private lives and how these private lives have shaped, you know, very public histories. One more, and then maybe we can open up to questions, because I actually would much prefer a kind of conversation rather than me just sort of blabbering away.
Sure.
Yeah. And then I can always pull up more images of other work as our conversation kind of evolves or develops, continues.
Sure. Thank you very much, Pio. That was a great intro already. And so I thought we could kick off some of the, you know, our questions for this conversation by bringing something that another artist had said, the Japanese musician Sakamoto. And he was recently saying that for him, true creativity came through something, creating something entirely new, and also through destruction. And I was wondering what you think about that, how that might be involved in your own practice.
Destruction, huh?
Creation, like creating something completely new in order to, you know, destroy the old system, for example, or the old.
No, I think that's kind of, I mean, I've never heard the quote before, and I think it's quite appropriate in terms of like I said, the work of the title of the drawing series, for instance, is Notes on Decomposition. So this act of taking things apart to kind of understand how that history exists in the context of now is sort of appropriate. And maybe there is an element of that process of like, I guess, deconstruction and rebuilding that exists in my work, in the sense that a lot of the objects that I kind of include in my in my practice are objects that have been, if not witnesses to, then, and not only witnesses but also accomplices to kind of moments of political or economic upheavals. So this act of kind of looking at these things that have caused so much destruction and then turning them into works of art that allow another understanding of history is maybe how I would interpret that quote.
Great, thank you. I think we had quite a few questions. I don't know who would like to go next.
Let me open my chat as well. Oh.
Hi, it's Chris.
Sure.
Thank you, Pio.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing those illustrations that you start off with. I found them very intriguing, and I start asking myself and thinking about how these objects, especially those objects, those blue vases, have great historic importance to that particular Chinese culture. How were they acquired by these people? What are the true facts behind the acquisitions and the holdings of these private collections?
Mm-hmm. I think what was interesting as I was trolling through, I don't really know how they were bought. I'd imagine they would have been bought through antique shops in Mayfair. It wouldn't be that imaginative, I think. But what I found interesting as I was looking at these auction catalogs, and we're looking at a kind of key figures from very different parts of the world, whether it's the Marcoses from the Philippines, Margaret Thatcher in the UK. There's even like that. It was one of them was the first Christie's auction in mainland China. I was also looking at the collection of the Ceausescu couple, Elena and Nicolae, in Bucharest. What I found interesting was as I was kind of trawling through these collections was they were actually all quite similar. Everyone had the blue and white vases, everyone had some silverware, everyone had fur, everyone had like fancy watches and a very specific sort of type of furniture from Chippendale furniture. So what emerges from this research is not so much the kind of elements of cultural difference, but actually that people in power kind of subscribe to a very similar kind of language of ornament. And so much of that is tied to imagining themselves as, the most civilized members of European culture. So there's that. What actually runs through this entire collection is a history of empire and a history of colonialism and how that shapes the aspirations of even the most powerful.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Who's next?
Okay. Hi there. I've got kind of two questions, if that's okay.
Yeah,
the first one is, I noticed that on your website, about a historical conversation. Yeah. And the first question is, what specific discussions would you like future generations to think of your practice? Because on the course we've been looking at the idea of archive and ongoing archives. And the second one is more of a kind of just interest with regards to not a shield but a weapon work, which I looked at for ages, thought was amazing. And then with regards to that practice, the message is really interesting, but also with the supplier, how would you get access to so many handbags? And when you do so, what's your kind of mindset with regards to the layout? How do you go to the arrangement of those handbags when you get them? Is it something you've thought of before and pictured, or is it something that when you see the bags and the space, it's more site specific?
Yeah. Okay. Let me pull up that image just so people know what you're referring to. So this is a work from 2016, and it had 2 iterations. One was in Glasgow, and this particular image is in Art Basel, Hong Kong, in 2017. So this work is based on one auction item from the Thatcher sale, and it's a handbag from, I think it's Asprey black leather handbag that she famously was carrying in this sort of iconic photo of her with Ronald Reagan walking Ronald Reagan's dog. And, you know, with that one object, you know, obviously it embodies so much the kind of government and the kind of leadership that Margaret Thatcher kind of espoused. And also I was interested in this idea of how one object can basically summarize or take the place of one very complex political figure. And I kind of wanted to make it even more complex. So this handbag, which I only had an image of, I then kind of brought the image to a handbag manufacturer in the Philippines, in a town near Manila called Marikina, which was very known for producing leather goods in this up until the sort of 70s and 80s. But when the Philippines kind of joined the more global market, which in a way was something that Reagan and Thatcher had kind of started, this idea of kind of globalized trade and globalized production, the whole industry in that town kind of died because production largely moved to China. So I then commissioned one of the remaining bag manufacturers to produce these, I think there are 180 handbags, sort of really bad knockoffs of the famous Thatcher bags. So within that process of kind of choosing an object and then replicating it, in a way, I was really interested in this idea of one, understanding how, you know, the decisions of one individual can affect the world. And two, it's like trying to uncover all of these hidden relationships between economies, people, histories. And it's really that, to answer your first question, it's really that I want people to take from my work, that, you know, underneath, you know, the most mundane object is a whole network of relationships that kind of have shaped the way we live and are shaping the way we live. So nothing, in a way, no object is ever innocent. They're always guilty of some kind of crime, in a way. Can I go stop that? There we go. And I think, yeah, that's kind of, for me, that's also, that way of thinking has also dictated like what material I use. So like I said, like I start with drawing, but then as the work kind of evolves, so many other kind of materials, so many other different ways of working, so many other kind of collaborations with other makers come into play. And that, I think that's important. I think, as while the work begins with drawing, it sort of takes its own, it assumes a different material life depending on the history that I'm researching on.
Hello. I think all really enjoy your talented work. I also got two questions. The first one is, what is the significance of repetition in your artwork? And another one is, why do you often use fabric in your work? And is there any connection between fabric and paper?
Sorry, was that fabric or?
Yeah, fabric.
Okay. In terms of repetition, I think I'm drawn to the grid, as you can probably tell from my work, the role that the grid, I mean, I'm interested in the way that the grid was obviously something that began as a kind of modernist gesture. But then the idea of infecting the grid with ornaments is interesting because it reasserts, very messy histories within a sense of order. And I think there's always that kind of tension between my work of order and order in terms of like the way objects are elegantly placed and objects are kind of very specifically installed. But within that order is the kind of the disorder of the histories that the objects embody. And in terms of the fabric works, yeah, you're right. So I've been making a series of works on silk, actually, over the last 12 years. God, that's gone by very fast. And they're based on the format and the design of silk scarves. And silk in particular, I think, is something I find interesting because, again, like talking about the non-neutrality of objects. Obviously, silk, as much as it's like a sort of luxurious object, is tied to histories of empire and histories of quest. Like they're saying that, I read somewhere, or maybe it was in a documentary on the Silk Road, where Europe, I'm trying to work out the exchange, but basically there was this exchange between silkworms and horses, and that's how like one side of the world managed to get horses and the other side of the world managed to get silk. And obviously horses and warfare are kind of inextricable. So this idea of kind of silk as a sort of soft, delicate material being the bargaining chip for an animal that kind of then became a vehicle for war is kind of interesting. That there is always this sort of this conversation happening between delicacy and violence in a way, and maybe that's another thing that's sort of implicit in my work, that while I'm looking at all of these objects and all of these materials, all of these ornaments, underneath all of these ornaments is actually a history of violence, whether it's economic violence, political violence, or actual kind of actual war. So it complicates things. And I think the use of fabric, the use of silk in particular, was something that's part of that interest. And the use of silk scarves in particular, like appropriating Hermes patterns, goes back to this interest in kind of, I guess, how horses operated as part of the empire. So Hermes, the luxury brand, actually started as a saddle and a bridle company before moving on to kind of what we know of it now. So actually, it actually was instrumental in, say, the colonial exploits of France. So like I said earlier, like nothing is innocent. Everything is kind of complicit in some kind of history of conquest.
Thank you.
Let me just pull up one of these silk images so people get an idea of what it is I'm talking about. Bear with me. Yeah, so this is one of the works that Yoon was into. And the series is actually called Every Tool is a Weapon If You Hold It Right. So it kind of, I think I got it from, I think it's a pop song lyric by Annie DiFranco. But I found it as an interesting kind of rephrasing of Walter Benjamin's like famous quote that all documents of civilization are also documents of barbarism. So this idea that, you know, aggression is embedded within everything is interesting. And as we're seeing more and more as the world around us kind of goes through this incredible period of upheaval, that it is true that there is an embedded violence in everything. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think CU1 wanted to ask you a question as well.
This is my question. Being as an artist, do you inspire yourself when you're stuck with new ideas? Do you have any purpose or trend to making art?
Gosh, how do I answer? I think maybe for me, this idea of making work has always had a kind of armature, or a kind of, in a way, a structure, and that structure I think is related to growing up in the Philippines. And I'm just trying to work out how to kind of explain this. So I think at the root of my interest in ornaments, in history, in violence, is the experience of growing up in the aftermath of the Marcos dictatorship in Manila. And I think in terms of a sense of purpose, that kind of trying to kind of unpack the experience of living under that regime and living in the afterlife of that regime has sort of given form to how I think about making work. I haven't gotten to that point in talking about the work I make yet, but so in a way, the sort of foundations of the practice is this interest in the collection of Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos, and that's somehow been able to, that somehow allowed me to, I guess, to think about work as a way of, you know, putting together collections, putting together inventories as a way of people to understand histories that have been forgotten or that have been sort of pushed under people's memories. And I think, I don't know about trend, but in terms of a sense of purpose, that's foundational to me. For instance, one sort of 10-year long project. And I think in terms of running out of ideas, one of the things I seem to have been doing over the last decade is having these series of works that literally I've been doing for the last 10 years. So I clearly haven't exhausted them yet. So I'd say I'm fortunate in that there's still a lot of things that I need to understand, and there's still a lot of material, a lot of histories that I still feel like urgently needs to be represented. So that's always been the kind of the driving force behind making work. And so, yeah, so one of these, alongside the scarves and alongside the drawings, one of this other long-term project I've been working on is called The Collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders. Sorry, they've decided to sort of have a truck outside my house at the moment, which is a collection of trying to reconstruct the collection of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, which a collection that they actually bought through public money. And I guess the public has never seen this entire collection. So this project has been about reconstructing this collection through different ways. And one of the more recent iterations of this collection is in collaboration with my wife, Frances Wadsworth-Jones, who's a jewelry designer. I've actually reconstructed Imelda's jewelry collection. Again, so going back to the element of collaboration in my work, I think this is sort of pushing it in another way. And we actually remade 24 objects from Imelda's collection and presented them as 3D sculptures. Let me pull that up. So this one is like a Cartier tiara that she tried to smuggle with her when they fled for exile to the United States. And we were working with some kind of, with single photographs that we were able to have access to. And then it then made sense to kind of reconstruct them. So they were kind of remade digitally, facet by facet. It took quite a long time. And then they were 3D printed with this sort of white resin type material. So they kind of they do resemble jewelry, but they also look more like the ghosts of jewelry. Yeah, so I think in terms of a purpose, I think this idea of the inventory as a way of understanding history is at the core of everything. And that kind of, in a way, gives me a lot of clarity in the kind of work that I want to make.
Thank you.
So that was a very long-winded answer, but I got there in the end.
I learned a lot about
Hi, Pio.
Hi.
My background is industrial design.
Okay.
And I think the new materials or new technologies is the necessary part in the field of industrial design.
Yeah.
And I like to know, in the field of artists, do you think that new materials or technologies such as 3D printing will allow innovations, but also great limitations? And also, could you think what some of these innovations or limitations would be?
Yeah. Well, I think just talking about my practice specifically, I think certainly these new technologies have been incredibly useful in being able to imagine forms and create forms that I wouldn't be able to create otherwise. And in terms of, as I was talking about the 3D printed sculpture, it's being able to create facsimiles in an almost forensic degree is interesting. But also in terms of kind of CNC milling and 3D printing, it also means that something that you've created, to fit your hand, you can then, because the 3D file can be resized to whatever scale you want it, it allows you to then create something monumental while keeping the kind of integrity of the form of the little object. So just as an example, in an exhibition in San Francisco last year, as a continuation of that collaboration with my wife, we decided to create a monumental version of one of the pieces of jewelry, which is again an ongoing series that we're still working on. But this is one example of, I guess, technology allowing me to kind of create something that I wouldn't really be able to create otherwise. So from the 3D sculptures, we made a 3.5 meter long concrete version of the bracelet using CNC carving. And so you're able to really imagine something, not just imagine, you're able to create something on a much larger scale without losing the integrity of the file, really. And for me, this is a new way of working. Like I've always been hesitant to work with sculpture unless they had the same level of detail as my drawings. And now that's something that's very possible. Because I don't have the aptitude. I can draw, but I can't sculpt. So this, by sculpting with software, you kind of, you have that same level of detail and accuracy that for me is very important in the work I make. And you can also translate, things in different materials. Like one of the things I'd love to do at some point is to create, like a 2 meter high version of that tiara in like rusted steel or something. And I know it's possible. I just need someone to fund it. But it opens up the possibilities of making in ways that wouldn't have been imaginable even 5 years ago, I think.
Okay, thank you, Pio.
Pleasure. Yes, I think, as you can see, like my work's really kind of, it does take on so many different materials, so many different processes, and I think that's been the most interesting aspect of being an artist, is being able to translate things, and through those translations being able to talk about so many different histories, so many different narratives, and kind of connect the dots in a way.
Okay.
Yeah, the truck has gone, thankfully. I think they were picking up the recycling downstairs.
Thank you, Pio. I actually have a question coming from Henry Muñoz, who was the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader this year. And he has a question actually about your art and democracy. And he was wondering, what role do you think art can play in protecting and encouraging democracy?
Yeah. I think, well, given that democracy seems imperiled at the moment, I think, as I'm sure all of you are aware, me and Alice are from the Philippines, and there's so many different ways that the current government is trying to undermine democracy, using the pandemic as an excuse, really, to curtail people's liberties. And what's emerging now is the different ways that artists can actually work with either historians, activists, kind of intellectuals, to be able to imagine things. And I think art is important in being able to imagine what's possible, and to be able to visualize the kind of democracy that we need. I think art has to be part of that conversation. So that can and that's manifested itself in different ways. So some artists really work within the context of activism. So it's even the act of creating posters or creating the paraphernalia for protest. I think more and more you see how crucial art is in being able to present that. But I think from my own practice, the role of art in democracy is, for me, it's art. My art in particular, I see it as a tool for people to understand the past, to kind of connect history with the present. And through that, you're able to kind of, I guess, demand certain things, whether it's accountability from past leaders that have done incredible amounts of injustice, all the way to actually art as a way of reconstructing objects as evidence, which I guess I see the jewelry reconstructions, for instance, as I see them obviously as very seductive objects on the one hand, but by reconstructing an entire collection of ill-gotten wealth, they also have a forensic function, which is, this idea of imagining them as literally as evidence of a corrupt regime in a very direct way. So there's so many different ways that art can function as a democratic tool. And for me, I see it as a way of teaching history, as a way of making history visible. Because I think, one of the interesting conversations that has happened recently, for instance, is, we're becoming aware of how many painful histories have been silenced or are in the process of being erased. And art, by, in a way, resisting that erasure, by making things visible, becomes a really important tool.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very insightful.
Hi. Yeah, I just had one more question. You said previously that you do work through a lot of different processes and materials.
Yeah.
So when you're not actually making something for a specific installation or a specific piece of work, which material do you turn to just have a play with? Which is your favorite material?
I think it's really the pen and the paper, drawing. It's really how I think things through and how I start developing work. And at the moment, it's the only work I can do. But I think that becomes that's really key. And that's really how, in fact, because so much of my practice involves other makers in a way, the main activity that happens in my studio is me on my drawing table.
Thank
you. Thank you so very much, Pio. Yeah, my question is this. After trying so much to see which direction I take this, I think I finally realized that this aspect will not only be useful for me, but for many other people as well, because a lot of artists struggle with that. And my question is, basically, personal and political stories woven together in objects and images relay different messages to the audience, mm-hmm. and can be sometimes misread, mm-hmm. I mean misinterpreted by different people from the audience. Do you worry about this at all? Or do you put this into consideration before all of your exhibitions?
I think I worry about it, yes, but at the same time, like once anything is out there, it really becomes open to different readings, unless you kind of really dictate how people should understand the work. And what I try and do is try and be as generous as possible with the contexts within which I've created the work. So I write quite a lot. So when you go to an exhibition of my work, there's always quite a lot of text that I've written that whether it's, I produce a lot of artist books, I often write the kind of essays of my work that appear in catalogs. So I think for me, it's important to be as generous as possible with the information or with the context within which I produce the work. But ultimately, it's still up to the reader to A, look at the object, and B, read the text. So there is still that role that the audience plays in interpreting it. What all I can do really is provide all the clues, but whether they're interested in the clues or they just want to see a pretty drawing or a lovely piece of fabric on a wall, then that's also their prerogative. So, you can't control everything. And I think if you try and do that, you just go mad.
I quite agree with you. Yeah, a lot of artists struggle with that actually. And it's something that's a bit personal to me too in my making of works. And thank you so very much for this. One more question, please. This is another thing that I feel it's common with many artists as well. Listening to you and seeing, your confidence in the way you exhibit your work and in all of the installations I have seen so far that you've made. Were there times you felt your works were in some ways minimalistic and you had to step back to look around? I mean, looking at other artists, and at such points, what do you bring back? What do you take from looking outside, looking at other artists? What do you take from there? What do you bring back to your work or to your thinking?
Well, I think I always look at, as you can see from behind me, I have a book addiction. And so that conversation with other artists, other works is very important. I don't operate in a vacuum.
Okay.
And I think my confidence comes from exactly this, in a way, it's a privilege to be in conversation with artists that I really respect. And this confidence comes from the fact that I'm having had these conversations, having seen, like living in London, you take for granted and even now in lockdown, you really take for granted how much art you can choose to see on a daily basis living in this city. And I think for me, this sort of sense of being an empowered artist comes from, having seen these things and having been in conversation with people I respect. I get a reassurance knowing that what I do is still able to add to the conversation. And I can only get that assurance having seen work, having read essays, having met up with artists. So it's really like, it's this, in a way, this sense of confidence really comes from having a strong sense of community.
Okay. That's great. Thank you.
I think also on the kind of positive, I'm normally a skeptic, but I think what I found interesting through all these like Zoom meetings and WhatsApp chats, and that there is such a strong sense of care that people are looking for, and maybe as much as, you know, we talk about the limitations that this pandemic has created for the world, you know, the cultural world that we all exist in, there's also like an awareness of what has been missing over the last 10 years, you know, as, you know, the ease of jetting from one biennial to the other, one art fair to the next. I think people kind of forgot the element of care that actually art, you'd hope, kind of embodies. So maybe that, you know, having that conversation, being, you know, art being earnest is not really a thing that was not really a conversation that I was having when I was at art school. You know, there was an amazing value given to like irony or skepticism, but maybe these conversations like care of community, of working together, maybe that's the good thing that will come out of this apocalyptic scenario we're in. That the conversation has shifted, in some ways not very good, and in other ways maybe it's shifted in ways that will force us to make changes for the better.
Fantastic. Interesting.
Actually, Pio, thank you. I wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned earlier on innocence, and as you said, you know, we're both from the Philippines, and your art is, I find, incredibly, you know, especially relevant nowadays with, for example, the whole, you know, Black Lives Matter, and how we have to, you know, to be even more aware of what we can do and can't do, and compassion.
Yeah.
So my question in regards to that and to innocence is, do you still manage to find a balance in between encouraging and creating innocence and authenticity of vision without being jaded?
I wouldn't use the word innocence. I think I'm too far gone for that word. But I think it's a struggle to fend off being jaded, I think. But I think you insist on, I think, like a lot of people, maybe in the last few days, I've finally got to see Hamilton on Disney Plus. And it's a strange thing to be watching now, because the world that it inhabited, this sort of like the post-racial society that Obama had created, and then watching that piece now, there's such a disconnect between the reality that we're existing in and the kind of the context within which that piece of art was produced. And I've been reading a lot of like conversations about how, like, why it's not right for the times, which I think are valid, but at the same time, like, the way that a work of art like that can actually change the way we understand culture, the way, you know, I think the antidote to being jaded is seeing work that really transforms the way we understand ourselves. And it's not necessarily innocence, but there is, like, creativity has amazing power to imagine things that we can't really imagine existed until it just exists. Does that make sense? And I think art has an amazing power to make things exist. And whatever, you know, obviously the meaning of art can change over time, and it can lose significance depending on, you know, the way the world changes, but you can never kind of disregard how it can bring things into existence that has never existed before. That's what art is, right? It's new information that's given form, and that informs, that shapes and changes the way we approach the world. Maybe not innocence, but I'm idealistic enough to believe that good art can do that job. I'm not idealistic 24/7. I'd say like I have an hour a day where I can do that, and then you're skeptical again. But you know, you hold on to it while you can, and you don't do it all the time, because that's delusional. But yeah, sorry, that was, I don't know if that answered the question, but
It did, thank you. And I completely agree. We're also very aware that you're very busy, so we don't want to take too much of
no,
you.
I think it's been great. It's been great chatting. Thank you so much.
I think we're just all very grateful for you to come and share so many of your experiences here.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you. I hope that was useful.
It's really, and I'm sure the audience also will greatly be enjoying this. And best of luck with all your current and upcoming projects. We're looking forward to seeing all the things you'll be coming up.
And I hope to see you guys in real life at some point.
Exactly. When we can all reunite in some other parts of the globe. But
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you so
Cheers. Bye bye.